Hey everyone, as usual, I'm going to try to do a short commentary that will probably run at least twice as long as I intend it to because I have no self control in that way. But I am trying to put out these commentaries a little bit more regularly. Of course, it's been a bit of a slog these last few months, but things are accelerating around the world. And frankly, I don't see very much, if any, real solid analysis of these issues. So hopefully I can provide some of that. Anyway, today, not going to talk about Russia and Ukraine, at least not on this one. I do want to focus on another country where we have major tensions and potential for conflict, and obviously the broader international, regional, and international implications. And I'm talking about the African country of Sudan. It is in the news, although it's buried amid much more interesting news for most Americans, that there is major instability in Sudan. Just to give a 1 minute crash course in recent events, the longtime dictator in the country, Bashir, was forced out by a protest movement a couple of years back. The protest movement essentially was made up of various sectors of civil society, mostly including middle class professionals, teachers, doctors, lawyers, etc., but also those connected to trade unions and other working class institutions, and even some from the rural countryside as well, although they were a bit less of a presence. And so it was organized primarily on social media. It was tremendously successful. There was a great deal of optimism around the fact that this war criminal and longtime dictator Bashir had been essentially deposed, although not so much deposed as, the protest movement forced the military junta that he was the head of to basically remove him. And that's what happened. There was a temporary caretaker government put in place with the intention that it would sort of facilitate a transition to a democratically elected government. Now, fast forward a couple of years, and that basically has not happened. And because it hadn't happened, the caretaker prime minister basically, and again, I'm glossing over all of the very significant, developments here that took months, but the caretaker prime minister, steps down or was removed and then asked to come back and then ultimately stepped down, forcing the military junta to basically come out in the open and seize control and not even have the pretense of a civilian government, as a sort of the artifice. So we are now in a situation where the so-called Sovereign Council, that is basically the military government, the military junta, is now openly clinging to power. And the question is, what does this mean moving forward? There's a couple of things to think about here. First is the question of why they're doing this. It's not just about power, although, of course, power is at the center of this. This is also an attempt, I think, quite rightly, to shield themselves. I mean, the leaders of the military junta, to shield themselves from what they expect to be war crimes charges being brought against them. Bashir presents sort of a warning to them. Bashir is facing those war crimes charges, and these other generals who directly had a hand in some of the genocidal activities that were going on in Darfur in the early part of the century, and then also potentially other criminal activities that they were involved in, corruption, which is a major, major problem at the highest levels in Sudan's government, and so forth. So you have this very small clique of, these extreme, pro-dictatorship elements that are now in control of the government. Now, on the other hand, you have the protest movement. The protest movement is not only is it still very much present, it is actually pretty successful. And let me just very quickly try to highlight a couple of key elements. So as I mentioned, there are various aspects of aspects isn't the right word. There are various sort of segments of the working class in the movement. The Sudanese Workers Association for the Restoration of Trade Unions released a statement, decrying the attacks against students, against protesters, and their Their statement was co-signed by a number of other individuals and organizations. I guess I'll just read a couple of them. The Information Technology and Communications Union, the Union of Workers in the Electronic Cable Services Company, the Union of Workers of Al Jazeera University, the Union of Company Pharmacists, the Preparatory Committee for Pharmacists, Union of Workers at Khartoum University, Petro Energy Workers Union, Nurses Union, Veterinary Union, Medical Cadres Coordination, Preparatory Committee of Sudanese Psychologists, Union of Workers at Nyala University, and on and on and on. You can see that there are not just many unions, but unions from various industries, various segments of society that are all kind of converging, congealing in this protest movement. And they're, of course, not only decrying the violence that's been carried out, but they're actually been calling for general strikes, civil disobedience, and all of the nonviolent tactics that one would expect of a democratic protest movement. So this is the situation as it exists right now in terms of the domestic politics. And again, as I said, I'm very much glossing over many key details that we just don't have time to go into. But at the international level, the United States and the Western allies have more or less come down pretty unambiguously on the side of the pro-democracy movement, the protesters. They have singled out the leaders of the junta, threatened them with sanctions, threatened them with, criminal charges and so forth, demanding that the dialogue that was originally promised by the military junta, that the dialogue with the protest movement will be restarted, etc. None of that has happened so far. The junta has more or less rejected all of that, and just today, today being January 28th, released a statement essentially implying that the protests are being orchestrated from abroad, more or less using the, I don't think they use this terminology, but more or less using the color revolution explanation that the Russians and others are fond of, using for any inconvenient pro-democracy movement. Basically suggesting, without outright saying it, that the United States is orchestrating this movement from its embassy. Now, there is, of course, reason to question what the United States is actually doing here. The United States has a long history of meddling in protests and, supporting its preferred actors and so forth. But as of now, we don't see much in the way of the traditional sort of elements of a U.S. orchestrated political destabilization. We don't have a single pro-Western charismatic leader that the U.S. can prop up. We don't have any hand-picked successor to be, called as the new president in the way that you had with like a Guaido in Venezuela, or even somebody like Navalny in Russia. There is no individual charismatic figure of that kind. So the relationship between the United States and the anti-junta elements is a little bit murky. I mean, certainly the junta is suggesting the U.S. is orchestrating this, but at least as far as I can tell, I don't see much in the way of evidence of that. Of course, there's long-standing NGO connections between, the Enough Project with George Clooney and others, and Soros funding for some of these NGOs that have been active since the Darfur crisis of 15 years ago. All of that exists. It's, of course, all part of the U.S.'s broader soft power engagements and strategies around the world, but it's a pretty big leap to then say that the U.S. or any other Western country, the British or the French or others, are orchestrating this. Of course, it's highly unlikely that that's the case. It seems much more fine-tuned explanation for the junta to be able to justify a crackdown. That crackdown is ongoing as we speak. Students are being targeted for violence. Other protesters, workers have been targeted. Of course, there was this pretty high-profile assassination of a high-ranking police, I think captain or police general, but it's still unclear who is responsible for that. The protesters and the various organizations that are associated with the protest movement. By the way, I should note, just like we had in Syria 10 years ago, in Sudan, you have these local coordinating councils done at the neighborhood level, at the city levels. And these coordination committees and councils, they are the ones that are essentially communicating with each other and representing what you might call the sort of grassroots of the opposition movement, or the grassroots nature of this opposition movement. So, in any event, that's what's happening internally. The United States and its role, USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, CIA, etc. All of this is, of course, always in play. It's in play for every instance where the United States has interests, and the United States, as Kissinger famously said, has interests everywhere. So that is the nature of imperialism. Now, let's just quickly talk about some of the issues to keep in mind when it comes to Sudan. One that I've talked about here a number of times is not Sudan specific, it's regional, and that is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. This is this massive water project to dam the Blue Nile in Ethiopia that would provide for Ethiopia's economic development, but potentially have very significant negative repercussions both for Egypt and its water security, as well as Sudan. So that issue is very much central because, of course, and I have to do a whole separate commentary on the situation with Ethiopia, but Ethiopia is engaged in its own pretty high intensity conflict with the TPLF, the forces of Tigray, and that has made Ethiopia something of a pariah internationally, at least when it comes to the United States and the perceptions from the West. And so this is now leading to what you might call a regional conflict here, what seems to be rather likely to be a regional conflict. Remember, you had refugees fleeing the Ethiopia-Tigray war over the border into Sudan. Now you have Sudan utterly destabilized. Of course, Somalia on the other side of Ethiopia remains politically chaotic and security challenged, with Turkey a major player there now. Turkey also attempts to be a major player in Sudan. Turkey has been ejected out of Sudan with the loss of Bashir, which was a close ally for Turkey. So what you see then is regional powers, not only regional, but really global powers like Russia and China and Turkey, all having their eyes on the region. And with this kind of instability in Sudan and the ongoing on-again, off-again civil war in South Sudan, what you see emerging is an entire region on fire, essentially. So when we talk about Sudan, we're not only talking about that country, the north of Sudan, as it's called Sudan now, and we're also talking about South Sudan. We're also talking about northwestern and western Ethiopia. We're also talking about questions related to Egypt and water security. So there's a lot of things that go into this. I'm already almost 15 minutes, so let me just close it up by saying that you really have to be cautious about one-dimensional narratives from, Western analysts and so-called analysts, because again, the issues are very complicated and they are almost never one-dimensional in that way. So people who are calling Sudan a color revolution probably don't really know the first thing about the class dynamics of the uprising, of the protests. I would urge people to take a look at the MENA Solidarity Network, MENA Solidarity Network, Solidarity with Workers in the Middle East, MENASolidaritynetwork.com. That's a good website. It has a lot of excellent information. Protesters are being killed. It seems like it's happening every day. The situation is very fluid. It's going to evolve, and of course, it has implications way beyond the borders of Sudan. So keep it in mind. Put Sudan in your news feeds, and check back with the Patreon feed, and hopefully I will have some more information for you guys on this and other topics in the coming days. Thanks again for your support. Talk to you soon.